Thank you so much. Thank you, Safi, for the kind introduction. As you can see, today I will be talking about the interaction of ethnic or sometimes ethno-national identity, as scholars tend to call it, and the interaction with regional and national identity in Donbas in the context of the war. And specifically, I will talk about the case of people with dual nationality. Although I have to say that I'm still in my first year of my studies, I haven't done any field work yet, so I do not have any empirical evidence. Here, I will be mainly talking about how I'm gonna approach this question and where this idea is from, basically. Here is just the structure of the presentation. I will start with some theories, and I will actually put my research question and methodology at the very end, because I really want to show you how this idea is from. It's basically from the previous research, the weakness of previous research, and how to improve it. So that's why I'm gonna tackle this at the very end. I'm gonna firstly talk about a little bit about theories. I'm gonna talk about a little bit of historical background of particularly about the Soviet nationality policy, and also talk a little bit about the history of Donbas. And also I will try to point out the current trends in Ukrainian national identity research, and then finally is my research questions and methodology. So in conflict studies, we have seen so many conflicts with where identity plays an important factor in it. And identity can play an important role, not only in the very beginning of the conflict, but it can also leave a very enduring legacies in the post-war societies. Recently, I was reading a book about Abkhazia. It was really interesting. So the author did ethnography in Abkhazia and interviewed about 200 people. And the polarization of identity had emerged before the war in Abkhazia through low intensity inter-ethnic conflicts. So people react at the very beginning of the war based on their understanding of who is to be threatened. And very famously, like in the case of Bosnia, we know ethnic identity probably didn't play a very important factor, didn't play a very important role in the initial stage of the conflict. But then after the war broke out, ethnicity became so important, especially after the constitutional constitution in Bosnia was published, then ethnic categories are really inscribed into every social, political, economic fabric of the society. But what is the identity when we're talking about? It is such a vague thing, and people generally believe that identity is constructive, it is fluid. It's very hard to be captured and understood. Some people argue, for example, Brubaker and Cooper appeals for the cancellation of identity simply because it's just too difficult to capture the processual, fluid, and evanescent nature of identity. They suggest that we should study identification rather than identity, because identification has a connotation of process in it, and we may ask about who is the agent to identify, who is the actor to do so, such things. I will take a more vague definition because it's where it's come from in psychology. Identity is a cognitive construct referring to people's self-categorization. But importantly, identity is not only about social categories like ethnicity, nationality, etc., but also your individual experience as a person is also very important. It's also an essential part of your identity. But unfortunately, in political science, we tend to pay attention only to social categories. We rarely look at how individuals' personal networks, and we really ignore like individuals' personal stories, which makes sense, but it's just very hard to capture all the nuances if we ignore the individual's personal stories. And then I will be talking about historical background. Here, we all know that the organization of 15 Soviet republics and of many subunits as well, they were founded based on primordial understanding of ethnicity, of culture, of language. And then in the 1920s, the Garnization policy in different titular republics to develop the language, the culture of that republic. And most importantly, starting from 1932, people's ethnicity started to be documented in passports. And that's very important because now people have a clear perception of the boundary between different ethnic groups. And the acquiring of the documentation of nationality was not arbitrary. You couldn't really choose ethnicity only to take one of your parents' ethnicity. Only in the case of mixed family, you can choose ethnicity. Otherwise, you can just more like a heritage. But starting from 1960s, starting from Khrushchev, he started to mix people. People were traveling across different republics to maybe they resettle to a new republic to take designated jobs. The boundaries of different Soviet republics existed really only on maps, but Soviet citizens really could travel across the Soviet Union without any restrictions, which made them to orientate themselves in a wider context rather than the single republic they live in. At the same time, officially, there was a discursive construction of a united Soviet people, which goes beyond ethnicities. However, at the same time, the documentation of nationality still remains, which gives a very interesting contradictory connotations to the word nationalist in Russian or nationalist in Ukrainian, because then the very meaning of this word straddles in between the English terms ethnicity and nationality. It's very hard to interpret in the surveys if you will use nationalness as the sole signifier of one's identity. The Donbas region is also very interesting because it was a part of Novorossiya. There was a very short-term republic in Donbas and its nearby regions, which is called Donetsk Kryvyi Rog Soviet Republic, which was founded with the aim to be against the Ukrainian People's Republic based in Kiev, because Donetsk Kryvyi Rog Soviet Republic was against all sorts of Ukrainian nationalism. This was in 1918. And then a very important thing in this region was the Nazis' occupation. The Nazis' occupation and the heroism of Soviet fighters really left an important imprint in local historical memory. That's also when we talk about local identity of Donbas. Even now, like people, the leaders of the so-called self-claimed republics, they still refer to the Soviet past, the Great Patriot War, as something very important of local memory. It was also a role model of the mixing policy. The intermarriage was so common in this region. The intermarriage rate peaked at 55% in the 1970s. With the massive urbanization going on at the same time, there was a huge migrant flow, particularly Russians moving into this region. And the economy was so strong, and there were some slogans like Donbas feeds the whole Soviet Union, and subsequently Donbas feeds the whole Ukraine. Even though just prior to 2014, just prior to the war, the economy in Donbas was not that strong anymore, but some people say it has formulated a so-called identity of imagined economy, which plays a very important role in people's mindset in that region. Ukrainian national identity has always been a very interesting and always been a popular topic in academia. At the very beginning, people thought, oh, ethnicity should work as the same in Ukraine, and ethnic identity is very important in Ukraine. But it's just simply not true. Already in the 1990s, there were some studies by doing surveys. They were saying, oh, actually, language seems to be a more important factor than ethnicity to predict one's identity. And then there were a few more nuanced ethnographic studies. One of them did ethnography in Lviv and Odessa. In Lviv, people with Russian origins, they also view themselves as Ukrainians rather than Russians, because they think it's like a common sense of belonging, loyalty to the state rather than to something else. And in Odessa, people who used to feel Russian, they also started to feel like more like a Ukrainian. There was another very interesting ethnographic study which was conducted in a school in a small town in central Ukraine. And teachers were saying, oh, Ukrainian is our native language. This was really well accepted by students. However, outside of the classroom, students only speak Russian. So it was accepted as like Ukrainian is our native language, but Russian should not be delegitimized as something else. It's still acceptable to speak Russian. So what I'm trying to say here is not ethnic identity for sure, but it's ethno-national identity. And some people say native language is your ethno-linguistic identity, because even though sometimes you probably don't speak Ukrainian that well, but Ukrainian for you has a sense of your roots in it. So it's more useful when to use native language as your predictor rather than language of everyday use. And nowadays, scholars even develop even more nuanced language categories. One of them is called language embeddedness, which means you speak this language because probably your family speaks it or you have to speak it at work. Another one is called personal language preference. It's most like the most spontaneous language in your cognitive level. And in order to document that, researchers had to speak a common word which exists in both Ukrainian and Russian, and to see in which language the human participant is going to respond, and then document that as individual's personal language preference. So that's it. And then after 2014, there were a lot of surveys being done in Donbas. In general, Donbas, quite surprisingly, is more and more pro-Ukraine rather than Russia. And according to the outcomes of the surveys, Ukrainian citizenship is the most important signifier in this region, rather than ethno-linguistic identity also. However, these surveys, they were done with the people in non-Ukrainian government-controlled areas of Donbas were excluded, and people who fled to Russia were excluded as well. But the general trend is here, and is actually this trend can be projected to Ukraine as a whole as well. People were talking about the development of civic identity in Ukraine, because according to surveys, Ukrainian citizenship is a very significant factor, and more people regard Ukraine as their homeland. Also, language-wise, people tend to start to learn Ukrainian, and people were in favor of the Ukrainian language policy. Even though one thing I have to say here is the very meaning of these categories were changing all the time. When we say being Ukrainian, we sometimes may feel, oh, being Ukrainian probably means you have to speak at least a little bit Ukrainian. But after 2014, the general trend is even if you cannot speak a single word of Ukrainian, even you only speak Russian, you can still be regarded as a Ukrainian citizen or Ukrainian ethnicity because the very meaning of being Ukrainian was changing and it was becoming more inclusive. So that's why people were saying, oh, Ukrainian identity is becoming more civic. But the things to consider here is what can be really counted as the criteria for civic identity in the Ukrainian context. I have seen some papers, like some scholars use nationality as a criterion of civic identity, but some other scholars use it as a signifier of ethnic identity. And also, I remember an interview excerpt. I think it was done by Oksana Shevil. She was writing that she interviewed a Ukrainian woman from the East, and she just said, my father is Russian, my mom is Ukrainian, I speak both languages, I don't know how to combine these two identities, which makes me think probably people can combine different elements of Russian or Ukrainian identity at the same time, but they just simply cannot be reflected in the surveys, because in the surveys we have to choose one option, but we can actually combine different elements of these options together depending on which context you're talking about. So that's why I think survey-based methodology probably is a little bit problematic in terms of capturing. It's good to capture a general trend, but it's not so good when it comes to capturing all the very nuances here. What I'm suggesting here is it's called narrative political identity. Essentially, it's just about the stories of our human participants. Human participants tell about their lives, and as they are trying to make sense of the social reality, as they trying to seek coherence in their narratives, their identity will emerge in their narratives. And the most important thing here for us is the context. We want to know in what context his or her Russianness matter. In other contexts, his or her Ukrainianness matters, and how to combine them. So it is a very useful tool to combine both social categories and individual experience to put their social categories in their everyday experience with the world, which is also good for us to have a processual and relational perspective, and we can see how different actors interact, how different actors interact, and how we can go back and forth to see what factors are only contingent or only situational, what factors are more long-term throughout his or her narratives, what factors only appear in specific, very rarely in specific contexts. So now I want to say why I chose people with dual nationality. First of all, because they are not the middle ground between Russian and Ukrainian. Their behavior is not the middle point of them. And additionally, being Russian and being Ukrainian, they are also not mutually exclusive categories. As I said, in Donbas, the intermarriage rate once peaked at 55%. So numerically, they were really significant, but they were not included in. They were included as Ukrainians in the first and only Ukrainian national census because they were not given an option to claim their dual nationality. And many of them had to re-identify themselves as Ukrainians. But most importantly, I want to say here is this case really gives us a very good example to provide a chance to think in a not in a methodological nationalism way, but in a groupness. We can very easily to check Russianness and Ukrainianness, how it works. And my research aim is, since I'm looking at a very, very specific example, very specific case study. So I want to look at the mechanisms between these identity categories, and to see how they interact with each other. And most importantly, because there's a war going on, and I would like to see how the war has been changing the dynamics of identity. People in the war setting, they're normally their social networks normally are hugely affected by the war, and I want to see how this has imprint on their identity. And also, by looking at this, I'm trying to find if there are any occasions or situations when they can show their resistance to these ethnic categories. Whether they can defend themselves as an ordinary citizen to all these so-called dirty politics and political categories we put on them. So that's it, and thank you very much. Slava Ukraini!